Philip Fine, and I'm in the room. As you know, our former chair is no longer on our governing board, and the vice chair of this committee, board member Ben Benoit, can't make it today. So if everyone's okay with that, I was asked to lead the meeting. So I will do that with no objection, hopefully.
Well, I have my card up and I have.
Okay, so first we'll see who's with us on the phone. So at EPA. John, are you on the phone? Maybe not yet. Anyone from Air Resources Board?
Yes, Brian Clerico.
Okay. Anyone from SEEB?
Hi, this is Janet.
Hey, Janet. And we also have Riverside. Anyone on the phone?
Riverside Transit Agency, Larry Rubio. I'm here.
So, okay, we'll go to the agenda. Why don't we do a round of introductions so that people on the phone know who is in the room. I'm Philip Fine, Deputy Executive Officer at SCAQMD.
Bill Wong with General Counsel's Office.
Denise Peralta-Gailey, Public Affairs Manager.
All right, I am production.
Jacob Allen, AQMD.
Mark Bassett, planning.
Tyrone Turner, Dakota Communications.
Kurt Coleman, Southern California Air Quality Alliance.
Bridget McCammon, Vista.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Dan McGivney, SoCal Gas.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
Martin Hansberger with Holiday Rock.
Dave Edwards with CARP.
Mike Carroll with Lakeland Watkins.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. So next on the agenda is the minutes. Any comments on the minutes from last meeting?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, lay it on us.
I hate to belabor this, but well, I don't actually. On page 2, at the very bottom, where it says Bill Lamar inquired. Bill Lamar inquired if the rule 219 and 222 unpermitted but registered sources will be included in the regulation. That should actually be inquired if rules 219 and 222, or because they're unpermitted and registered, 219 and 222 respectively. But then the next sentence is that Patrick, Mr. Gaffney, responded that currently it only includes permitted and registered sources. So really, he's answering my question.
And I contradict.
And then you complicated it a little further.
So Dave, what did we mean?
You mean that it should, Patrick should have only said it
Permitted, I think.
permitted.
Right. That's what I mean.
Not registered, just permitted sources.
So we will amend that to say includes only permitted sources and strike and registered.
Okay, and then Philip, I guess when you said will not be required to apply, what did you mean by apply?
I think that's worded incorrectly. It should say those registered under will not, the regulation will not apply.
Will not apply.
Will not apply. So I'm going to strike be required to.
Okay.
Sorry, just sloppy language.
And with that, I'm satisfied.
Okay. Any other questions?
Sure.
Bridget?
I guess with my comment, my concern was that community action should drive the agency's data, not the other way around.
What page are you on?
Which page?
Page 8.
Under discussion?
For community concern to drive the agency's data.
So it says, indicating how the agency's data should drive community action. And
Which that's okay. That's, my concern was that the stakeholder was saying that concerns or advocacy should drive data, which I think is concerning. That was my comment.
okay.
Which it was miscommunication, so that's fine.
Okay. Do you want to send us a
Sure. I can do
potential
that.
change to that? We'll just adopt that if everyone's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Any other questions on the minutes? All right, so I'm going to ask again whether anyone from EPA, John, whether you've joined us on the phone yet?
Hi, Phil. Yeah, this is John. I'm here now. Sorry, I was delayed getting on.
No problem. Want to give us an update on EPA and federal activities?
Sure. There's a few items I think typically that Amy reports on. So there's the Diesel Emission Reduction Program, often referred to as DERA, and there's about $10 million in funding for our region. And I believe the applications have all been submitted and are being reviewed for that this year, specifically in the context of clean diesel programs. And I guess we're anticipating some kind of announcement by the end, later this summer or early fall, about who's going to be getting those the funds. Similar thing with targeted airshed grants. The applications have been received and reviewed, are being reviewed for those funds also. So 2 large pots of money to help fund cleaner projects are going to be available soon. On the safe rule, that's happening. We're just waiting at this point for the rule to actually be finalized. We're expecting that to happen, although in terms of when, it's anybody's guess. It could be this spring or later this summer. I don't have knowledge about what will be in it. I couldn't tell you if I did, but I think we're all anxiously awaiting that, and I don't know when it'll happen. But it'll have a huge impact, of course, out here in California. And nationally, EPA is working with CARB on what we call the Cleaner Trucks Initiative. This is for national rulemaking, so that's good news, and efforts are underway on that. I don't have a lot to report other than a notice of proposed rulemaking is expected in 2020. But that is good news that that's underway. And then something more local that I'm intimately involved in is we are working on a notice of proposed rulemaking on the South Coast Ozone Plan. This is basically taking a lot of what's in the 2016 AQMP and EPA taking action on the ozone portions of that. It's been a long haul getting to this point, so I'm anxiously hoping we can get that action signed by the end of the month. So we're very, very close, and there's a lot of momentum to get it signed. So that'll be a big deal. Of course, it'll be published in the Federal Register. There'll be a formal public comment period for that. So you can all look forward to that, hopefully being announced sometime soon. And I think that's about it. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but that's it for now.
Okay, Art, we had a question here.
Yeah, this is Art Montes. Last time I understood from you that there was a pot of money that was available, I believe, for vehicles or for agencies or anybody to apply for, and there was going to be an extension on that pot of money. I've had staff, and I've been driving staff for I'm on the school board. So we've been going after pots of money. We were cut off last time on some buses. But when you mention money, my ears always perk up. So I'm looking at that 10 mil that you have right now. Is any of that money available, and what is it available for? And when's the timelines on that? And the problem is that we have my staff has asked cities and others, so for contact using those platforms, and we've gotten no feedback from them and county governments. So how do we get access to that money?
Well, this is Johnny. I'll just say that 10 million has already been, I think the window for applying for that is already closed, but this is an annual funding mechanism. So I know there's people, probably Phil could tell you who at the South Coast helps put those grants together. And I don't know, Phil, if there's a way to work with Art to see if there's opportunities in the future, or I could put Art directly in contact with people here in the region who are, fundamentally working on those kind of programs day to day. I don't personally, so I can't say too much about when the next cycle will be and how to, go about putting in an application. But I think Art, maybe we can talk on the side directly, but I think the South Coast may have staff also that can help give you some tips on how to get involved in that process.
So what are the categories that you're looking at for the 10 mil?
Well, in this case, it's for clean diesel projects. I don't know, Phil, if you have any examples that come to mind or somebody else at the district.
Yeah, I'd have to talk to Matt or Naveen. I'm not familiar with the applications we put in the current round, but they are. So maybe we can.
Also, I don't know, given this administration, do you have any other monies that may be available now or in the future, or coming down the legislative pike that we could either tap into at the local level for schools or other entities?
Are you asking me that question?
Well, yeah, that's who I'm asking, whether it be solar or whatever.
I know DIRA is a very common one. I don't know if there's other pots that are coming.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. What did you say?
There are a lot of grant programs that are out there. Some of them are limited in terms of who can actually apply. Sometimes they're limited to states and districts. Some of them are more broader in scope and stakeholder involvement. I can look into that and try to get back to you, Art, about the kind of the range of programs.
Yes, so in particular, we're looking at, because we're trying to move towards lower carbon footprints within the district with solar. We've got some solar projects. We've worked with Anaheim. We're looking at some water projects. And so we're combining educational programs with the children, and then also using it for the solar for outside shelters or around the kindergartens and those types of projects. And they're 9-acre and 15-acre sites. So we probably got the largest amount of sites available in urban areas. So if you can look and see if there's some money that might be left over or some pilot programs, and if I can get your number from staff, from AQMD staff, and then contact you directly, and we could also work with you on some legislative measure. So thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to follow up with you. I don't know how to best go about that in terms of my contact info, but we can definitely get that to you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Any other questions for John, EPA? Okay, with that, Brian, are you on the line?
Yes. Just a couple items on the CARB control measures calendar for May. One is some proposed amendments to the suggested control measure for architectural coatings. I don't think that'll have any effect on South Coast, since I think South Coast architectural coatings rule already reflects most of the limits in this voluntary model rule. Then the other item is proposed Community Air Protection Incentive Fund guidelines. So CARB staff has developed some additional guidelines for allocating money for AB 617 projects, and these will cover or expanding the funding opportunities for stationary sources and what they're called community identified projects. So this is in addition to mobile source funding, which was previously allocated. Farther out on the control calendar, there's June through October, there's proposed alternative certification requirements for zero emission powertrains, regulation for proposed zero emission airport shuttle buses, and item related to vapor recovery certifications for above ground storage tanks. If you're interested in any of these items, I can perhaps get some program staff here for the next meeting, or I can certainly follow up in the meantime with any questions you have and get those answers to Anne. And that's it.
Okay, we have at least one question here, Mark.
Yeah, Brian, I know last year there were AB 617 community air grants. Is that scheduled yet for the second round?
That's a good question. Yeah, on my notes here, I don't have that. If those have been awarded, you mean?
Well, when the grant would open for proposals.
I mean, from what I know, they're working on the solicitation now, and probably within a month it'll be out.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
about right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can follow up, get some specifics for you too on that.
Thank you.
Brian, this is Carlo from the Sierra Club. I just had a follow-up question regarding the zero emission airport shuttle rule. Since the Air District is also going through its MOU with airports as part of its indirect source rule, it'd be good to get just even a few numbers of what is the air overlap in terms of the number of airport shuttles within the air basin, what is the expected carbons, emissions savings that we can expect to have when the rule is implemented. So just kind of what is the impact we can expect to gain if this regulation is adopted by CARB?
Okay, good. Yeah, I'll get that information for you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, if you send it to Anne, we'll distribute it to everyone on the committee. Any other questions?
Yes, okay.
Any other questions for Brian? Okay, next, legislative update. Phil Crabb is home with bronchitis, but if you're not, we have Denise here to fill in. So she'll give the legislative update.
Great, it's my first time, so before I go into the update, I wanted to just introduce myself. I actually joined the district about 3.5 months ago as a public affairs manager. Prior to that, I served as managing director for a consulting firm. So in that capacity, I managed a statewide trade association for private water companies, a regional water association, and a special water district. And then I also worked on other district projects. So happy to be here. I was asked to cover the meeting this morning, so if there's any follow-up needed, I will be happy to provide that. But let me give you a quick update on first the status of SB 732. So we did ask Senator Allen to actually pause the legislation, and this was reported at our last legislative committee meeting. On April 20th, we received a letter from the senator indicating that his intent was actually to move the bill forward. As a result, our executive officer, Wayne Nastry, did attend the hearing at the Senate Governance and Finance Committee, and the bill passed on a 4-3 vote. The bill will be heard by the Appropriations Committee on May 13th, which is this Monday, and it's my understanding that we will be present at the hearing. Any questions on that?
Which committee is this on the 13th?
Appropriations, Senate
Appropriation.
appropriations.
Question, do you know if the bill's been modified? That was a discussion at the last hearing as far as come back and do some modifications.
So two things on that, it was modified. There was some changes to the Department Tax and Fee Administration. Amendments were made to that effect, but then also on May 6th, which was this Monday, we submitted technical amendments, and we also submitted some oversight language, which was requested by the board at the last board meeting.
That was that oversight committee or
Correct.
working group, whatever it
The
is.
structure of it, who can be a part of that committee.
Will that be introduced on Monday?
That was submitted to the author's office. It's for his consideration to adopt. Any other questions on SB 732? Okay. With that, I'll go into our updates on the bills that were adopted or the board took a position on at the last board meeting, which was on May 3rd. In total, that was 4 bills. So there's AB 836. It's a bill by Assembly Member Wicks, which would establish a statewide program, which the bill defines as clean air centers. So these are public centers, and I don't know how much detail I should go into at this point. Is that okay? Okay. Clean air centers, so it's basically public centers that would be accessible to the public in case there's a wildfire or other smoke event, and that's a support position on that bill. We also took a support with amendments position on AB 1500. It's a bill by Assemblywoman Carrillo, and it would basically expand the authority of a CUPA, which is a Certified Unified Program Agency or local health officer, to suspend the permit or shut down a facility if the operations at the facility pose an imminent or substantial endangerment to public safety. We did ask that the bill include amendments which would not restrict our agency's authority to shut down a facility if necessary, and that's an authority that we have under AB 1132. That would just ensure that there's more coordination. We also took a support with amendments on SB 44. It's a bill by Senator Skinner, which would require CARB to develop a strategy for the deployment of medium heavy duty vehicles for the purpose of bringing the state into compliance with GHG reductions, 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. We also took a support position on SB 633. It's a bill by Senator Stern relating to the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, which is based in Ventura County. It would require OWEHA in coordination with others to develop and implement a monitoring program to collect data on contaminants from the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. We will be working with the author's office to ask that they consult with us as there is a potential for upwind air impacts to the basin. We also took a support position on SB 747. It's a bill by Carper to reauthorize DERA funding in the amount of $100 million, and would also reallocate unused state funds to the National Competitive DERA Grant Program. The next meeting for the Legislative Committee is on June 14th. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Denise?
I have one.
Sure.
Is there any funding available, any bills that are gonna be carrying any type of funding for clean air?
Well, there's several bills. I mean, of the ones that I just listed, there's SB 740, well, SB 747, SB 633, or I'm sorry, SB 747 and also SB 44.
I think you mean S747.
I'm sorry, S747 and SB 44 specifically.
And what's the nature of what the project that they fund?
So SB 44 is basically focused on medium heavy duty vehicles.
Okay. And
And I can, let me pull that up.
And who's usually the disbursement agency for that, or
That would be CARB, the California Air Resources Board.
this gentleman here then, right?
Yeah.
Not personally.
I'm just looking who the bankers are for this money. And the other one is that 44 is for heavy vehicles, right?
Yes.
So that would include buses or any other type of transportation?
Well, it says technology to implement measures. Let's see, hold on one second. Let's see. technology advancements and other measures to reduce GHG reductions. And it doesn't outline specifics in those bills, it just gives targets.
Does it give amount of money that's
So
gonna be?
I'll read
key-
it
Is there any
specific,
money?
I'll give it specific, I'll read it specifically. To update the state board's mobile strategy to include a strategy for the deployment of medium heavy duty vehicles in the state for the purpose of bringing the state into compliance with federal ambient air quality standards. If you're looking for specifics on the amounts of funding, that's not stated in the bill.
So it's all theoretical.
It's to
and-
develop a statewide strategy.
And so it's a wish list, this is what we would like to have. And Santa Claus, if you can bring the money, put it in our basket.
I cannot speak to the
No,
opposite.
I'm just looking to see if, if there's,
Is this the bill that originally had some allocations and then it was pulled out?
So it was amended, and let's see,
who was the author on that one?
this is Stern, Senator Stern.
Oh, that one.
Is that up
Yes.
north or what? Is he up north?
I believe so.
Yeah. And you had 47 was the other one?
And I said S747 by Carper.
By who?
Carper.
Carper. Is he up north too?
It's a federal bill that's funds the DURA program that was mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's a reauthorization of DERA,
DERA, and what is DERA?
That's not
Diesel
money.
Emissions Reductions Act.
Okay.
For district.
Yeah, it's just asking for reauthorization of $100 million.
So it goes to like,
Well, I
special
actually
districts
have
and such.
I
It's the
actually
states.
have our previous spending, so we received $4 million in fiscal year 2016, 2017, and 2018. And I have those details here if you wanna.
Okay,
look at
and now
them.
that's statewide?
That's
Yes.
federal, 100,
It's federal.
100 million nationally. We generally,
Well, that 4 million is really gonna go a long way, huh, statewide?
generally the state gets about a tenth of that, so close to 10 million. We usually get about 4 to 5 million.
Oh, for this district?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's divided per each district, so you get 10 million. And then, do you have the allocations, how it went out the last time?
I do in front of me, I do have these
Okay, can I
allocations
get
here.
that from you later?
Sure, yeah.
All the allocations are just what was in the district.
What's in the district, and how much of that money's still left on the table?
None. There's an open solicitation now we talked about earlier that we have submitted applications for.
Okay, how long is that window open for?
I think it's already closed, they're just doing the evaluation.
Okay, can you check on that? If it's closed or not?
And we can tell you what our applications ask for.
Okay, because people always tell me the window's closed and it hasn't been closed.
But these particular grants are, again, for diesel equipment, mostly mobile source diesel equipment, and the eligibility for applying is limited. It's not anyone can apply. It's not like a truck owner can apply. It's districts. And there's a few
Well,
other
I have a
entities,
truck
government.
that's 90, it's a 94, so that puts it, what, 25 years old? I think I've been trying to change and we use it to deliver.
But again, you're not eligible for DERA grants.
Oh, okay.
As an
Oh, what
individual.
you're saying is non-mobile sources or mobile?
No, I'm saying eligibility are government entities for DERA.
Well, we're a government entity, a school district, I'm on the school board.
I thought you were talking
Oh,
about.
yeah, I wear a lot of hats, remember that?
I'm not sure exactly where I know it's districts primarily, but I think there's state and local air districts, but I think like the port has got some money before, so I don't know exactly where.
Yeah, so I got,
it
this is a truck, okay, that I use to deliver food for reduced lunch, some of my schools are 90%. And then I also serve something like 40,000 meals during the summer. And this is one of the trucks that we use to service
So Art,
those meals.
this is one program. We also spend between 150 and 300 million a year on other programs.
Oh,
I know
so
staff
great,
has
so you
talked-
got a larger pot of money that I can look at forward to.
You talked to our incentive folks many times about the opportunities, so if we need to get you those contacts again, we can.
Okay, no problem, thank you.
I did want to clarify, Senator Stern is actually from the Hidden Hills, Malibu, Calabasas area.
Oh, okay, good, so it's close by,
Any other questions?
thank you.
Okay, no other questions on the legislative update? So then we have Bill on the litigation update.
Thanks, Phil. There's actually no additional update apart from the status report I had submitted and you all have a copy of. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Your business is slow, you're not getting sued.
I know
It's very comprehensive in their update, in the written materials. Any other questions for Bill on that update? Okay, so for our next agenda item, we invited Dave Edwards from California Air Resources Board. He came down with his aero-proof vest to talk about the regulation that CARB is working on, the criteria and toxics reporting rule. So he'll give a brief update on where they are in that process, and then we'll open it up for questions. So thanks, Dave, for joining us.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Phil, for the invitation. And, so for today, what I'll do, you have my presentation, but I do want to go over where we're at with the regulation update process at this point, and then also talk a little bit about sort of the general requirements that are in this rule, et cetera. So just to kind of give a little bit of starting place, the Criteria and Toxics Reporting Regulation was adopted by our board in December of 2018. At that board meeting, there was a good deal of public comment and also board discussion. And in our board resolution, we were the board directed our executive officer to make updates to the regulation to meet some of the needs that were associated with board member comments as well as public comments that we did receive. So the one large update to the regulation, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation, was on the applicability criteria. And then there were other minor updates that we got, such as definitions, structure, et cetera, that we'll be making as part of our update to the regulation. So before I start to go over some of the updates, I wanted to sort of step back a little bit and talk about what is actually in the regulation at this point, and also to kind of give a little bit of framing for how we're developing this regulation. So this regulation, we're focusing right now on the applicability, so the who is really subject to reporting. And then we also have some very sort of general reporting requirements for trying to have consistency across the state. And also to mention that this is a joint implementation between CARB and air districts. One of the other items that I did want to mention is that this regulation, this is the first iteration. We do have placeholder sections and so forth for adding in method consistency. As part of our AB 617 legislation, there was the annual piece for reporting of criteria and air toxics, but there was also a method consistency piece. And so that, once this rulemaking process wraps up, we will begin to work on the method development side as well. So a little bit about the applicability. In the specific statute of AB 617, there were three types of applicability. And to sort of look at authority in general, we are looking at these AB 617, sort of the minimum requirements. We're also looking at other authority that we do have at CARB to help support some of our other programs, and also the more community-focused work that's been going on with AB 617 and also with AB 197. So the first main criteria is sort of a GHG criteria threshold, which is basically facilities that are subject to mandatory reporting. So those are facilities greater than 10,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. The second criteria is based on criteria pollutants, emissions of 250 tons per year. And then the third on air toxics of elevated prioritization score, which we have interpreted as facilities that have been designated as high priority by air districts. So these facilities, these are the, in general, larger facilities across the state. Their reporting requirements begin with 2019 data that's reported in 2020 using business as usual methods. And then for the GHGN criteria side, they're what we are terming as full reporting or meeting the full reporting requirements begins with 2020 data reported in 2021. And the elevated prioritization score facilities, the full reporting begins with 2021 data reported in 2022. And then the fourth bar down there, the additional applicability, this brings in a broader swath or group of sources to help support our broader criteria and air toxics programs across the state. And we'll focus a little bit more on this because this is the main area that items were changed during since December. So in general, just to kind of look at what an emissions data report contains for a sort of a larger facility, we're looking at annual criteria and air toxics emissions getting reported. There is some flexibility. I know that within South Coast, there's the AER program, which does look at emissions data. In many other parts of the state, it's based on activity and throughput data, and districts calculate the data on behalf of the facility. So there's activity and throughput flexibility or emissions allowed to get to the final result. For some of the larger sources, there's device and process level reporting. One of the main items that we really do want to emphasize in this regulation and also across our inventory programs in general is increased data transparency. So we are looking for the estimation methods as well as the emission factors that were used, just so there's a documentation to understand how the emissions were calculated. And then also location information and some general information about those facilities. So that was basically the core of what is in the what is in the regulation. The rest of the presentation will focus on how we've been updating the regulations since our December board meeting. So we've had 5 workshops in early March across the state. We shared some draft language, and we did receive some informal comments, extensive informal comments on that draft language. We have been working closely with the air districts, industry groups, and environmental groups to craft this language. And since our round of March workshops, we have met individually with many groups, and that input that we've received during the workshops, also working with the groups, has really modified what the regulation looks like now. The primary focus of these meetings was on the applicability provisions, but I think the way that we're sort of looking at this, the big board direction piece was to take the applicability away from instead of looking at a community focus, was to go to a statewide focus. And so this definitely does expand the applicability, but in order to help minimize impact on both air districts and facilities who would be potentially having some associated workload with this, we've really tried to focus on ways to minimize the workload by trying to incorporate phasing of the different categories in over time, as well as what we're terming as abbreviated reporting, which is a sort of more streamlined activity-based reporting that is fairly straightforward compared to some of the broader parameters that are in the regulation. So, and that's what the next slides will focus on. So as far as the applicability updates go, the big point of emphasis, and this goes to Bill's comment earlier on about the minutes, is that the applicability for this regulation is based on permitted sources. So unpermitted sources are not included in the applicability. The criteria pollutant threshold and This is for this fourth applicability category is greater than 4 tons of a single criteria pollutant and 100 tons for carbon monoxide. And then we have around 30 to 40 different air toxic sector thresholds, ranging from 0 threshold for some of the most toxic sources across the state to throughput and emissions-based sector thresholds as well. And so those are defined, and they range from things like gas stations to hazardous waste facilities, a wide range of these sector categories. So as I mentioned, the goal of these changes is to have more uniformity statewide. But in order to make this implementable and successful, we do want to also recognize that there's effort that needs to be done in many places across the state to collect this data, to accurately or account for the emissions associated with the activity data that we receive. So we have definitely been taking that into consideration as we've been going through this process. So we've established a phase-in for the annual reporting for this last applicability category. So if you kind of the beginning part, I talked about 2019, 2020 data for the larger sources. So this is for the fourth applicability category. So you'll see that there's 2 district groups. The district group A is air districts that have a year 1 AB 617 community. So South Coast, San Joaquin, Bay Area, Sacramento, San Diego, and Imperial. The district group B is all the rest of the districts. So they're basically the district group A. Let's focus on that one. The first column there, the 93401A, 4A, and B, that's the criteria pollutant thresholds. That starts with 2021 data reported in 2022, as well as the sector phase 1. And then between sector phase 1 and 2, there's a gap year, for lack of a better word, to kind of understand the lessons learned and refine implementation as needed. So the next phase would be 2023, reported in 2024. And then the last phase is sector 3, and also agricultural operations 2024 data reported in 2025. So basically what we've done here is expanded the actual implementation phase-in to about over 5 to 6 years, as opposed to having all of this kind of go in at a single time.
What are you doing in 2022 now?
Sorry?
For 2022?
2022 is the District B group, so all the other districts, and then nothing in the Group A.
Okay, so all the other air districts start in 2022 then?
Yes.
Inventorying and identifying their...
Unless they have the larger sources.
Unless they have the larger sources.
Yeah. So in addition to the sort of broader timeline, we've added these some of the sectors to this abbreviated reporting category. So sectors that have, in general, straightforward throughputs that could be multiplied by an emission factor and having some of the other parameters estimated. Natural gas combustion, generators, gas stations, cremation, aggregate processing, and then dairies and feedlots. So the piece here that makes this abbreviated is, instead of having to measure, we have some stack parameter categories, we have device and process level reporting. The facilities that are subject to this abbreviated reporting do not have to report those parameters. They can be estimated, and it also gives some flexibility to the air districts to be able to, in some cases, propose methods such as engineering estimates or other methods to get at the emissions from these sources within their districts. And I'll definitely take questions on this all towards the end as well. And then we have some other proposed updates also designed for timing, making very clear that this is just applies to permitted sources. I think it's now in our opening sentence. Kind of refined what business as usual means to allow for some flexibility even for the larger facilities early on. We've clarified the stack and fugitive emissions reporting requirements, mainly with the stack parameters to allow more flexibility to report these over time. And then we've also clarified the portable equipment requirements to limit to sources or perp equipment that is on a site for 3 months or longer and operating. And I guess I do want to end before we get into the next steps on a little bit of where we're going, how we're going to be using this data across many of our programs. So the first one is just to kind of start off with the bill that we associate in this, which is AB 617 communities. There's many requirements within 617 to really reframes how we evaluate air quality data across the state, looking at cumulative effects, et cetera, and also looking at communities. So this information collected at the statewide level is going to help support the selection of new communities and also really aid in the tracking of stationary source emissions in those selected communities over time. We're also looking to have this support AB 197, which was a bill passed in 2016 by Eduardo Garcia, looking at data transparency and public and putting an emphasis on public right to know. So some of the requirements in 197 on the inventory perspective was to put up emissions, criteria, toxics, and GHGs next to each other in a visual platform, and then update that data annually. And then the third item there is cumulative risk. So looking at being able to identify hotspots, enhance our modeling efforts, really be able to get into this new paradigm as opposed to sort of the current paradigm of looking at a source and seeing the impact it has on nearest receptors, to looking at the receptors and the impacts that multiple sources have on it. And then to also inform our historical planning, our historical programs such as SIP planning, air toxic control measures, and also land use. And on another note, so this regulation does really focus on stationary sources. We're also looking at many different ways to help improve our mobile source inventory to match the granularity that this regulation is going towards. We're looking at modifying some of our regional estimates for mobile emissions by augmenting them with some vehicle count measurements and a sort of vehicle distribution measurements through some of our automated license plate reading technology, and also looking at other different types of technology to try to leverage that at a more local level to try and augment our mobile inventory as well. All right, so as far as next steps go, we are looking at the release of the 15-day notice very soon. I put early May just in case something slides, but we're hoping it comes out within the next few days. There's the information there on where to get it from. Assuming we get it all right, we won't have to do a second 15-day notice, but the odds of that are not high. So there will likely be a second 15-day notice. We do have to then submit our documents to the Office of Administrative Law by October of this year, and assuming everything goes well, we're hoping to have the regulation effective January 1, 2020.
So
And then
Dave,
last,
the 15-day notice,
yes.
Down below that, you extended to 25 days.
Oh yeah, sorry, forgot to notice that. So kind of, I guess, jargony. We call it a 15-day notice. It can be longer than 15 days. The minimum is 15. We're actually going to be having it for 25 days. Thanks, Bo. I did not mention that.
Okay, so the 15 is 25.
25.
But you still have to call it a 15-day notice.
Yes.
All right.
15-day notice.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, just, and this is our contact information for myself and John and Patrick, who are doing most of the legwork on getting together all the documentation and so forth.
Okay, why don't we go this way? So, Dave? Dave, you and I have talked about this issue as far as default emission factors. And as far as how to deal with that, the way I understand the regulation sits is if you have to report, you have to report for a large list of constituents up to 5 million compounds, and no one has that information. So if you're reporting default emission factors and trying to educate the public as to here's your risk or cumulative risk, it's like yelling fire in the theater and alarming people when something's not really there. And I just had a current example of exactly what happens with this. One of our facilities actually depends on, someone was taking our gas from a landfill, putting it into a power plant. They did a risk assessment for EIR and used default emission factors, which really raised up the risk, which was non-existent, but that's what they did. Once it's out in the public, it's hard to walk that back, and now you have to alarm the public. So this very scenario is what I'm afraid of for this. Is going to be alarming people if something's not there. Has there been any thought on how to get realistic information out there?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think, and we've actually had this question come up multiple times across our different workshops, and I think the way that we're sort of looking at this is within our mapping tool, which is sort of is the platform that we're presenting data in now for some larger sources. All the mandatory reporting sources are there. What we're able to associate with that mapping tool, and I guess this gets to kind of your point on the messaging side of it, is to get ahead of the message as opposed to have a more sort of reactionary type of if someone does a PRA or Public Record Act to get the data. So within our mapping tool for specific facilities, if there is a substantial increase or decrease, we try to contact that air district and ask for, okay, well, what's the reason for this increase or decrease? And we do have a notes field that allows for someone to see, okay, well, that jump in between 2010 and 2011 data was due to a method change, not an actual emission increase. And so that's what we're envisioning here moving forward, is the more understanding we get with of the emission factors used and the data that's being used, the more that we can get ahead of the messaging and be able to caveat and message the data as effectively as we can. So when kind of requests do come in about, okay, well, look at this number at this facility, we can say, okay, well, take a look at our notation, or here's some notes on this to minimize that sort of the reaction.
I appreciate that, but realistically, I don't know if that's going to unring the bell. The problem you have is once you publish a risk assessment, it's hard to caveat that and saying, oh, by the way, this exaggerates risk. The whole point here is transparency to say, here is your risk in this community, rather than your risk could be as high as this. It's not real. I think people who receive the data want to know realistically what is the risk and have a good understanding of that. And that's my concern as far as how many people really won't understand it's an exaggerated risk. How do you unring that bell? I don't know if you can. That's why I'm advocating for, we need to go and look at the emission factors and refine that before people start reporting this and alarming people. Okay, we talked about maybe working separately, having that narrowed down, and hopefully you're receptive to working sector by sector with that.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Dan McGivney, SoCal Gas. I had a similar concern, about when I think in your slide 12 where you had data application and you were, going to roll out all this data, and in these early years, it's all coming from a wide variety of emission factors at all the different air districts and stuff like that. And understanding that AB 617 kind of requires you to at least get some certain sources to start reporting, but I think most of those probably could be garnered from the districts and stuff, and then do whatever caveating. But it seems to me that what should have been done first, especially before you bring in all these other sources and especially the smaller sources, is that you should have, I think, done the method consistency part first, right? Look at all the air districts, look at all the emission factors, look at how they're calculating things, and start going through that. What I know would be a difficult task, but going through that and developing consistent data calculations and as David said, look at the emission factors. I know the district's going to be doing that here soon because of some fees that they're going to increase in toxics, and a lot of people are going to want more specific emission test-based factors developed. So again, the default values are historically very conservative values. So if you're a small source and you have to report and it's a small amount, people use it because it's less costly than doing testing. But for this kind of a program, when you're going to throw data out in the public venue, like David mentioned, it's going to get used, it's going to cause concern. You're going to have data from different air districts from the same similar sources looking different. People, it just seems to drive a lot of unneeded concern in the public arena that could cause a lot of difficulty to sources and be very difficult to mitigate. And
May I actually build on that too? And I apologize for the interruption via phone, but it sounds like that we're actually repeating the problem of the past in that by bringing in new sources, small sources that don't currently report and not doing the method first, then all the districts have this flexibility to come up with their methods, and we're back to having inconsistent methods. So I think what Dan is saying about doing the method consistency first and then bringing in these sources seems to make some sense here.
Yeah. So I think and this kind of gets to some of the decisions that we were making early on in this process. I think from a public perception standpoint, getting something on the streets sooner than later, as opposed to going through, say, a method development process that could take years, many years. I think that was sort of the impetus for looking at the applicability side first. Now, that said, we are committed to look at the emission factors and the methods that are being used across the state. And even after that process, I'm not necessarily gonna, we're not gonna be saying that everybody has to go use this method to go do this, or everyone has to go install a SEMS to figure out your emissions and so forth. So there will still be some flexibility, even probably when we do develop consistent methods, but at least there'll be some bounds associated with that as well, and an understanding if there are certain emission factors used, what that means. I think in the near term, I think just looking at the case study of our mapping tool, we have had that data out there now for 3 years. GHG is integrated with criteria and air toxics, and it does show there is variability across districts and so forth. But I think going back to how we were able to message that and get ahead of that message, as opposed to having someone do a PRA and then use that data to write a peer-reviewed article that maybe mischaracterizes things, that's been a really big benefit of that mapping tool. We're able to frame the data better. So, and at least from what I've seen, and I know it's probably not the best thing to hear, but we haven't seen that public outcry extensively yet. We've been able to, I think, work through. So we do get questions, but we're able to work through it, and I think the way that we caveat it and message it has really helped. So
but on that note, there are ways to characterize those sources, because it's not saying that those sources shouldn't necessarily be part of the mapping tool and information made public, but do they need to be reported? I mean, you can have them be shown locationally within the same database as the major sources that are doing the reporting, but it just seems strange to then go forward with elaborate reporting requirements for them that we know are going to be inconsistent.
So this is Phil, Janet, and I think it goes to Dan's question too. So I think we all have the same goal of more accurate data. Some of that will be done through facility reporting. Some of that will be done through abbreviated reporting. And it is open to some other methods we can use as well. Even before this effort in AB 617, there was already an effort started because of the mapping tool, because of AB 197, mostly by the districts to get together and try to make the methods more consistent, the emission factors more consistent. There's still going to be variability because some facilities will have a source test, some will have SEMS, and some are going to use defaults, and it's always going to have that hierarchy of use the best available data available, but eventually you're going to have to default down to something. But I'm actually optimistic that that effort that's already started and driven by this rule and driven by, as Dan mentioned, our fee restructuring, that there will be a lot of effort over the next couple of years, even before some of these phases kick in, of at least a thorough evaluation of all those emission factors and where the problems might lie and where you might get some of those default very conservative numbers, and we'll figure out whether we're going to use them or whether there's other ones or how we message that. So I think it's going to get a lot better, and it's driven by 2 or 3 different factors. And one of the things that really needs to be done that we're committed to at least trying is that updating these default emission factors on a much more timely basis. Some of these are 20, 30 years old. Sometimes it's for a one-off facility, and that is always complicated. Who's going to pay for that? But where we can update them or use statewide efforts to, if you have 5 or 10 tests that are coming out relatively consistent, like to quickly be able to update an emission factor rather than, the generally drawn-out long process that happens, either with AP 42 or even at the state level. So we're going to have to be much more nimble, and you saw we've committed to having working groups on this locally, but there's going to be state, CAPCOA efforts and CARB efforts to do that as we move through this phase in. And again, one of the things that districts has been commenting to CARB on is making sure this phase in allows enough time for all that work. All right, so Bill.
Thank you. I'm sitting here in amazement. It's not often that I agree with Phil.
All the time.
But on this, I sure do. And I guess I have so many concerns about this regulation, which I've articulated to you over almost going on 2 years now, a year and a half, is this deeply flawed regulation or rule that CARB is attempting to roll out, and the time frame in which you're trying to do this, more for the sake of optics, than anything else. When you say, that, you're recognizing or receiving a lot of pressure from the public. Well, we're the public. We're just as much the public as being business owners and our employees as people who are residents or down the street or in the same neighborhood. We don't breathe a different quality of air than our next door neighbors. So, to rush something through because of perception by one part of the public versus another part of the public, it just doesn't make any sense. That's a red herring. The other concern another concern that I have is that this focus on small sources, which in turn are small businesses, and even though they're permitted sources, not so much on the criteria pollutant side, 4-ton side, but on the toxic side. And when I look at your table, your attachment A, your table with all of the thresholds there, some of these, I was going to say ridiculous, but overly conservative thresholds or unrealistic thresholds in some of these categories, like gas stations or dry cleaners. You have one category for isocyanates. Isocyanates are just about anything, adhesive, sealants, coatings, inks, and you have zero thresholds on that. I mean, it's like cornstarch or corn syrup. I mean, and to make these very small businesses have to go out and source test or determine from MSDS sheets or product sheets or something like that, where a product sheet will say less than 1%, which really doesn't tell you anything, or it may not be suitable for reporting purposes, whatever number they come up with. So, and in the absence of the preparation that Philip has just got finished describing, that should have, to me, that should all be put in place before this rule goes forward, or this regulation goes forward. Ideally, you know, if it is going to go forward, and I'm sure it will, you know, there should be de minimis levels, especially if you're talking about smaller sources, you know, rather than just a zero threshold. So when mobile sources are your problem, are the biggest problem, if you're looking for, you know, cleaning up the air, as you say you are. The other problem that I have with this is the district at the last governing board meeting was talking about their new toxic fees that they're going to increase some as much as 800%. I have to believe that somewhere down the line, CARB is going to be doing the same thing, because you're going to need funds to support your program here, this massive database that you're creating for doing annual reporting. And that's going to be even another fee on businesses, on regulated businesses statewide. In your comment letters, and I'll wrap up here, in your comment letters, there's one from White's Gas Station, from somewhere in Northern California, not too far from the Reno border. And he in essence is telling you that if you go forward with this, it's going to cost them $7,000. They have a little family gas station on a highway, and he's essentially telling you that they just can't afford it. And my only purpose in pointing that out is that that's going to happen with thousands of small businesses. They're going to have to make some serious decisions. Do I invest $7,000, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 in testing, or you know, do I just move to another location? And now, since you've made it statewide, it's not like moving out of one air district into another. It's just leaving or shutting down and taking the jobs with them. So those are just some of my concerns.
All right. Well, thanks, Bill. I guess one thing, to focus on one of the comments a little bit more, and that goes to some of the thresholds that we had in the table. What we've done, we have, as I mentioned, we did get a lot of comments. And another thing that we're also looking at are statewide ways to try to leverage our statewide data to help streamline or make a little bit less heavy-handed the reporting that we have in those tables. So, like, for example, gas stations and also auto body shops. I think auto body shops was in the first phase, and we've moved that now to the second. And what that's allowing us to do is we're looking internally at trying to look at our automotive coating specialty paint survey. It was last done in the early 2000s. We're looking at trying to update that in the near term, and by pushing that category out to 2023, we're hoping then that instead of having to look at SDS sheets for every single air toxic that's in every single paint used, we'll be able to generate the emission factors and the overall aggregate emissions based on the survey data that we do collect. So that would affect thousands of businesses across the state. Also on the same line as the gas station, we are trying to talk to some of our other agencies across the state to try to get the gas station data, for example, at the state level. So then that would also minimize the amount of work that a gas station would have to do. So
Yeah, excuse me, just auto body shops, the auto body industry. I don't know if it's 100%, but a good number of them. They do have these computerized paint systems that their paint supplier, Sherwin-Williams, PPG, whatever, install in there in consideration for carrying their line of coatings. And you can the operator can key that in when he's going to do a paint job, and it will calculate their VOC emissions for them. Now, if it'll do all of that, I don't know, but that may be an outlet for that particular industry or for a good percentage of them. But you still got, hundreds of other categories.
And then another item was on the sort of the narrowing or that zero threshold categories or the any categories. So in the new version that you'll see soon, we still do have some zero threshold categories, but the categories that we had, I think, any before on, we've narrowed now to a sort of a finite list of NAICS codes or SIC codes, so that there's more certainty as to who is subject to those categories. So and I think one of those specific ones that you mentioned was isocyanates. We do understand that is a prolific type of chemical, but we have narrowed it to the ones that are of the most interest now. So in that respect, we're hoping that helps with implementation certainty as to who is in or who is not in, and then also just to narrow the overall scope. So that kind of, those are some of the things that you'll see in the new version that were not in that version that came out in March.
Look forward to reading that.
It's interesting because I'm going to put my other hat on from the community side. The fact that you're putting, if you look at all the community, the majority of the communities that are affected are communities of color. When you look at any environmental issue, water, air, and such. And then when you look at those communities that are impacted socially, economically, same communities. And then when you look at where the railroads are located, where the ports are located, where other industries are located, it's the same areas. And going back to the previous gentlemen that spoke, those are industries that impact half the air, the bad air that we have. Yet we have no control because EPA controls it. Yet you put the burden on the small business guy that's coming to him, whether he be an immigrant or somebody here that may be starting up a laundromat, or a laundry service, dry cleaners, a paint shop, a upholstery shop, refinishing, any of those type of shops in those neighborhoods, because they're the lowest rent. They're in industrial areas. They can get a workforce that's affordable. All those factors. Yet, one of the things that I think that we need to look at when we look at the categories is if I'm located near a major threshold, say like the East LA area, the Southeast, you got a lot of diesel and truck mobility stations there that are transportation centers that are coming out of the ports. They may account for one part of it, yet you're going to put a huge burden on and they're corporate people. So they can afford to do all the testing, to do all these other things and all the regulatory. And yet you put the guy that's trying to, fix a fender but all these other things. So there's gotta be some type of balance to do that. And I'm just curious, did you go out to these communities and talk to these business owners? Not beyond the chambers, because if you look at a lot of the chambers, there are a lot of corporate people. Because, so they all have their mouthpieces and their PR people and their lawyers. And no insult to any of the other professions that may be here. But the little guy that's got a business doesn't have that person at the table. So it's like a lot of politicians, friends of mine tell me, if you're not at the table, then you're the meal. And this is what I'm seeing right here. Because we're trying to work in some of these communities with other industries, because there's some industries that we can probably work for the next 100 years, we may not be able to clean. And we're trying to work with them to provide jobs and such, and that's a situation, and that's a life, that's a situation in life that we're gonna have to work and do that. So at the end game, are we gonna, if we pass all these regulations, is it gonna bring it down 1 or 2%? Do we mitigate it at the cost of, a lot of jobs? Or is there a cost benefit in the question of toxics of lowering deaths? Because that's what you're looking at, health and safety. So where do you measure that? How do you measure that? I'm curious because from a policymaker, and you're an urban planner, or you're sitting on in a planning commission and you're gonna allow this and such, it's like housing. I mean, now I think it's about almost $30-some thousand to get all the permit fees just before you build a house. So somebody's got to carry that cost. And our communities are impacted. We're carrying the bad air quality, but we're also carrying the unemployment quality. So how do we fill that balance? And yet, the bureaucrats that probably live in suburban areas where they do have clean air. There's a good intention, but what's the outcomes? And I think that's one of the things that we have to look at, because there's got to be a balance between industry and the small guy and others. And that's my concern, because I go through a lot of these areas that in East LA and the Southeast, and you can go down blocks, and a lot of the places are boarded up. These are shops that have left someplace else, or they've gone out to the Inland Empire or somewhere else to do business. But it's hard to get, businesses back in those areas, and sometimes that may be the only areas that's zoned, especially for auto shops, tire shops, and these things. So I think when we look at policies, and I look at it, from the education component, if I put X amount of dollars, is it going to raise my intellectual level at the classroom and the outcomes? And I think that's one of the things that we've got to start looking at. And we've got to start working with industries and identifying those that mitigate, and not put so much the burden on the poor guy that's, that's trying to, keep his family fed and keep 1 or 2 employees. So there's got to be some regulatory outlet for them to be able to route, and not, like salmon going upstream. They don't have to be crossing the Hoover Dam to get to the next place. Or they, like the other gentleman said, they close shop. Some of the other businesses may be able to move, and they can afford to move to another state or another area. What does the other guy do? He put his 20, 30 years in that shop. He's got to pay another $7,000 to get a guy with a pin suit or somebody else to do the regulatory. And he just created another cottage industry for some bureaucrat that's coming out of some agency to provide the regulations. That's my concern. At the end of the day, is how do we balance those concerns in employment, air quality, and toxics in those communities? Well, because we don't seem to be at the table a lot of times. And there's maybe good intentions, but.
So we have, kind of go through some of your comments. Thanks. We have talked directly to some of the small businesses about what their sort of day-to-day tracking processes are. And at least from what I've heard from some of the gas stations and auto body shop owners we have talked to, that the tracking part will not be additionally burdensome to a great extent. as far as how we want to look at using this data, basically right now there's the data that we do have for air toxics, particularly across the state, is really in varying levels of accurate or and consistency, I guess is a good way to put it. It just isn't reported very often in many cases. So what this regulation really is hoping to do is to establish this sort of baseline understanding of what is going on so that we can do things like risk analyses that are more effective and able to help inform us where the most ideal places are, or what areas should have some risk reductions or other types of programs started in a more effective way than how we're currently doing it.
So what you're saying is that you're looking at a comprehensive drive public policy and public opinion to develop comprehensive resolutions for the outcomes and to mitigate those issues. Well, that sounds fair, but I think you're gonna really need to take a close look at, because sometimes, you're driving the herd and it doesn't go the way you want. It goes sideways and you get run over by the rest of the herd. And that's what I'm seeing.
So Bridget, question?
It's not a question, this is a comment. So most of my comments are already being covered by other members, and then I agree with Bill's comments and really supportive of the working group that's going to be going on for the toxic cities here. I guess I just want to reiterate, for the stakeholders I represent, our default factors are very old, some of them almost as old as I am. And I guess for the sake of transparency, some of the frustration that I've heard doesn't just come from my stakeholders, but when I've been in meetings, it's come from members of the public, it's even come from board members, that have been here on SCAQMD. And I think for this process to go through and for the numbers to be accurate and transparent, it's something that does have to be updated.
Okay, any other questions for Dave?
One quick one, just kind of art hitting there with me as far as we kind of know where the problems are. I mean, South Coast is very good at identifying impacted communities. And I just look at this rule and it's like, it's backwards. I understand transparency and letting everyone know what is out there and what the risk is, but in South Coast, you have the MAIDS program. You test ambient air, you test what people breathe, and that's how you found hexavalent and chromium. That's how you find problems. What's wrong with that approach? To say this is the real risk of what's actually in the air. It seems like we're putting the cart before the horse of reporting stuff we don't know, and you follow up later, we're doing ambient monitoring in the community. Don't you do the ambient monitoring first to actually figure out what the problem is? I still have a conceptual problem with that. Has there been a discussion on big picture, how much money this is going to cost, what's efficient?
Yeah. So as far as I think that's, looking at ambient measurements are one way. I think there's another school of thought where understanding sources and emission types would allow us to more strategically put out air monitors to try and identify the actual ambient concentrations as well. So
if that's a strategy as far as here, just let's see what the businesses are emitting and then we'll do monitoring to confirm it. That's a very different thing than telling the community, here's your risk or here's what's emitted. I mean, if that's the idea, that makes a lot more sense. It may be costly, but if everyone knows what we're going to be publishing is not real, it's just a screening tool, we'll come back later and test for it to see if it is real, that's a little different dynamic.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is Janet. I have one last quick one. Dave, I think that ultimately the mapping tool is going to be very, very important. And so could you say a few words about the status of revisions to that public-facing database? And also, have you considered actually bringing together maybe a focus group of different types of users to kind of inform whatever enhancements are being done and the integration between the reporting database into the visualization tool?
Yeah, so at this point, we're looking, I think, probably either this month or early June to add in 2017 data, so it'll be 2008 to 2017 data in the mapping tool. We're also, hopefully by the end of this year, going to be adding mobile emissions into the mapping tool to begin to start reflecting the mobile plus the large stationary. And then towards hopefully after that, then we'll start looking at the other stationary sources as AB 197 is having us look at. As far as the outreach goes, and I think, I forget, Janet, if we did some outreach to you, before we put out any sort of large changes like the mobile, we'll probably have some calls with folks. I like the idea of a focus group that can maybe bring together a larger group to evaluate how mobile is going to be represented in the mapping tool in conjunction with stationary. So as we get closer to that, I think we could circle back and work on trying to establish something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Dave on the phone, in the room? Last chance. All right, thanks, Dave, for coming down and presenting. We're all looking to see what the next version looks like. Okay, with that, let's move on to the subcommittee reports. Dan, you have anything on?
Right, nothing to report today.
Bill, on small business?
No, I really don't have a report.
Kurt?
Yeah, with regard to AB 617 implementation, we just spent a good amount of time talking about one facet of that. And I would say, in defense of CARB, I mean, when the legislation is passed and says you shall do this, it doesn't give you a whole lot of leeway to say, well, we don't think that's important, so we're going to ignore it. So it just goes to show, I mean, I'll be the first one to say that it would be nice if the legislature would consider stakeholder input as carefully as the district and CARB does when they're developing legislation. Because what we often get is legislation that makes for a lot of work and expense with maybe less than optimal payoff at the back end. So I would just also want to let everyone know, if you aren't following this, there's going to be a meeting of the Wilmington, Carson, West Long Beach Steering Committee tomorrow evening at the Carson Event Center at 6 o'clock. May 9th. Then on May 16th, the San Bernardino Muscoy Steering Committee will be meeting at 6 o'clock at the San Bernardino Valley College. May 23rd, the East LA Boyle Heights Steering Committee will be meeting at 6 p.m. at the Resurrection Church, 3324 Opal Street in Los Angeles. Draft community air monitoring plans have been prepared for each of these areas, and the draft plans are posted on the district's website. The district's soliciting comments on those plans. And then for round 2, as you know, community identification is an annual thing. And so apparently there are a couple of meetings scheduled, one will be May 22nd in Buena Park and the other May 29th in Colton, to invite people to come in and get brought up to speed on how you go about if you want to identify your community for consideration in the next round of community identification.
What does that mean, community identification?
For consideration as being identified as one of the communities under AB 617 for the clean air plans, clean community action plans, and the air monitoring aspect as well.
Are these for year 2?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Kurt. And again, I can update anyone if they have any specific questions on AB 617. Things are moving quickly, faster than we would like, but we're bound by some statutory deadlines. So these next couple months of meetings are going to be diving very deep into the specific measures and actions that these emission reduction plans will contain. Okay, Dave, climate?
climate, and this is kind of a broad subject, but it touches on kind of everything we've been talking about. CARB released a white paper April 18th regarding technical feasibility of lower NOx standards and associated test procedures for 2022 and subsequent model year medium heavy duty and heavy duty diesel engines. And, you know, it depends on what agency you're dealing with. CARB's looking for greenhouse gas reductions and also NOx reductions. We're looking at more NOx reductions. Obviously, CARB's focused on getting the greenhouse gas reductions, but there's a parallel as far as you want to electrify if possible for, you know, any kind of freight or any type of emitting mobile sources, which has been a priority here as far as how we're going to get to attainment. And that's kind of the nexus with this document. Is it's very interesting as far as timeframes, what's feasible, what's not feasible for near zero equipment. It's not as much zero emitting equipment for more near zero. And kind of the nexus, kind of home rule, we're looking at duplicative regulations, and it kind of delves into that as far as we have goals here in South Coast, CARB has goals, and in this case, at least for attainment, we're at the mercy of EPA of having the on-road heavy-duty rule. And this report has a nice little quote in it that I'm sure South Coast is aware of, that 60% of the total heavy-duty vehicle miles traveled in South Coast is from out-of-state trucking. So regardless of what you do here in South Coast, you're dependent on a national standard. And channeling Henry Hogo, I remember his slide once saying, if we don't get this rule by EPA on the books years ago, essentially we're not able to attain. And this all kind of weaves together as far as where we could go, what technology is going to work for all these different goals. And I know Phil's got a presentation coming up probably on the subject in general of the retreat. But just want to bring this up to everybody as far as it's interesting to see technologically what is being looked at. And it certainly looks like the technology isn't there yet and can't be implemented as quickly as we need to get to the 2023 standard. We'll tee it up for Phil for any kind of response you want on that big picture.
Well, I think that white paper is geared very specifically towards the low NOx standard. There's other divisions and groups at CARB looking at, there's a whole series of truck regulations coming forward. I think we're looking at all those different regulations as well, seeing what we can do to accelerate some of that, either through incentives or whatever authorities we do have on mobile sources. I mean, I'm not going to, we still need to talk to CARB about all these things, but in some sense, you know, that document is laying out a pathway for low NOx trucks, but separately from that, there's other pathways for zero emission manufacturer requirements, zero emission fleet requirements, and some longer term things. So one of the things we're trying to work with CARB on is making sure that's a comprehensive strategy on trucks and how EPA is going to play into that as well. So there's some work to be done there. I think that you're right that we are dependent on a national standard for new truck sales, but CARB does have authority for the in-use fleet, like the truck and bus rule. So there are some other authorities that go beyond just new engine sales that need to be looked at.
It's just an interesting dynamic as far as greenhouse gas goals to get to certain, you know, state goals versus what we need from EPA to help out on. And it depends on, you know, where are you going to spend the money? You know, if you're going to get to attainment here, you're going to go to the zero emitting of the vehicles. And it's just essentially what technology you're supporting if you have an absolute deadline. You have to get here by this date. You've got to get emissions down as quickly as possible. And it depends on each entity, each regulatory entity's drive and how you're going to work with other entities to get to everyone's respective goals. I don't know if there's an agreement on how you do that. How do you get everyone on the same page? Certainly EPA is not quite there yet.
It's not an easy thing, obviously.
No.
Agencies have gone to war over that in the past, and are currently at war on light duty, so it's not an easy thing to get everyone on the same page, but we're working in that direction. Any other questions for Dave on climate? Okay, let's So the next thing on the agenda is just a stationary source committee report. So in April, we talked about 1180, update on the fence line and community air monitoring plans, and also an update on 1403. And then what is tentatively scheduled, this agenda won't go out till tomorrow, I believe, or Friday. What's tentatively scheduled for the May stationary is just our updates to Reg 9 and Reg 10, which is our NSPS and NESHAP incorporation into our rules by reference. We are going to do an actual presentation on our reclaimed quarterly report. I know we go monthly with a written report. We're going to do more on reclaim, and also leading into some proposed amendments to our Reg 20 reclaim rules that we're going to be looking at for July. And that's all we have scheduled for stationary. Any questions on that? And then any other business that the committee wants to bring up?
Yeah. Can we have an update on how we're spending the money from the sales of the cap and trade? How that process goes and who gets it and how those decisions are made, how the sausage is made?
For last year, it's different every year. There's the legislature.
Is
it bipolar or what's
It is bipolar.
What happens is the money goes into the greenhouse gas reduction fund, and that's appropriated by the legislature. So, I mean, right now, that's going to be
part of
among the bills that the legislature will be considering this session will be how that money would be allocated.
So it hasn't been decided for this year.
Yeah, because I'm trying to see last time the reasoning, once, the thing went through the money stayed there for a long time. And then once it got litigated, they said, oh, you can use it. Now everybody had a father, right? So the money started allocating now for 300 million for a rainy day fund, so much for
Right,
super
so
train.
I think we can, since our next meeting is in July, and in theory, the budget has to be done by the end of June, right? Whatever comes out of that process, we can either do a brief presentation or distribute a table, what the legislature came up with this year.
So it depends on the 5 people that sit down in the room and decide how the budget's gonna be cut up. That's basically, that's the way it's gonna come up.
Well, everyone has to vote on it, but.
5, yeah, big 5. That's basically it.
Yeah, okay, that's what
They
I
do it
wanted to
more
know.
transparently now than they used to, but it's basically 5 people.
The same 5 people.
Well, the people change, it's just.
Correct.
It's
The table only seats
a
5
methodology, it's their mindset, right?
Yeah, but
And
if you'd
count
like
the
a
3 out of
report
the
out
5,
of what was
that's how it
decided
gets.
on by those 5 people, you should have
Well,
that.
yeah,
by
you learn to
July.
count. If it's 3 out of the 5 that you can get 3 people to agree to something, then it goes through. Okay,
Yeah.
that's what, I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
So do we have an action item on that? Do you want to hear what they
Yeah,
said?
I'd love to see the reasoning behind that.
Oh, you're not going to see the reasoning, you're going to see the.
The reasoning occurs in the room, and
Yeah.
5 people.
You're gonna see
I'm not gonna see the mapping or any of the reasoning or the criteria, the logic. It's just, this is the result, this is the
All you
outcome.
see is the sausage.
Yeah, this is the outcome. What comes out of that dark
The
room, right?
legislature is not subject to the same requirements that.
Everything's made in the shadows and whatever comes out of there is what comes out. Yeah.
We'll show you the sausage in July.
Okay.
Philip, taking up on a point that Kurt made about how, that we don't have much choice once the legislature passes a bill and becomes law, or even when they're proposing one, eventually that will happen. Rather than have folks like Dave here who offering him up as a sacrificial lamb at our meeting, rather than a report every meeting from public affairs, when we have a bill that's wending its way through the legislature, why don't we invite the author to one of our meetings? And
They don't have
to.
I call them inviting, it's just whether they accept it.
And we'll break out the nails and crown of thorns
Well,
and everything there.
But our
You're likely
meetings
to
are
get-
Wednesday, right?
Yeah.
So they're in Sacramento.
And you're
Yeah,
more
on the phone,
likely to
though.
get a staff
we can
person,
call
Or a
you're more
staff
likely to
person.
get a staff person who actually knows what.
That's a good
Yeah,
point.
well,
They're
yeah.
committees,
Staff
but
or-
Yeah, staff person.
You could have them go to Kelly PA office.
and find out what the intent
Carlisle.
is. You can find out the reason and intent.
I mean,
Then
we
you can
have,
ask them
we
what
have
the
people,
outcomes.
We have
sitting
remote-
down on this
remote
committee
locations.
here, so, you know, it's not.
We'll think about that. I mean, I think there are some key people and some key staffers in Sacramento. They're always hard to get down here. We invite them down all the time for various things.
We got telecommunications devices.
Send them an NTC.
All right, so we have some ideas for future meetings.
Talking about future meetings, I requested an item on enforcement that I thought Dr. Liu had agreed to, not that Dr. Liu's still here, interested, but I think the rest of us may be on enforcement. And I'm a little disappointed that Marion's doing a presentation on retreats, and I've been requesting this for some time, and it hasn't been brought to this group, which I think would be a nice feedback for Marion and Terrence. I still do think it'd be a good subject to bring back and get practical.
It's still on our list. And I've asked them every 2 months whether they're having to present, and they know it's coming. But that's still on the list coming up for the rest of the year. So they will come and discuss it at this committee. This month we had Dave here instead. I thought that was pretty timely.
That's very timely.
So, okay, any other business for the committee? Any public comment? Okay, we'll adjourn until July 10th. It might be
I can understand, but you know why you're.
committee makeup in this 2 months, we'll see.
And I think you're also.
Am I allowed to bring birthday cake? My birthday.
Oh, it's your birthday
Yeah.
today?
Yeah, July 10th.
Oh, July 10th.
Is that allowed?
It never-
Can I bring birthday stuff?
Yeah.